Thank you for joining me. I'm Gord Long. A reminder before we begin, do not trade from any of these slides. They are commentary for educational and discussion purposes only. Always consult a professional financial advisor before making any investment decisions. We've come to believe that U.S. monetary and fiscal policy has now reached the stage where it is inevitable that the value of the U.S. dollar will be sacrificed to keep the system afloat. I'm not saying the US dollar is going to crash, but rather it is inevitable that another 15% erosion in purchasing power is going to occur, which will be yet another blow to the US standard of living and ever-increasing inflation rates on a 70% consumption economy. Though we have discussed this previously, I thought I would reinforce in this session regarding why I feel this way. As such, I hope to cover the areas shown here. I've been asked to try and shorten these videos, which I will endeavor to do. Before we get too quickly into the details, we need to revisit some high-level understandings. There can be little doubt we are presently in yet another financial bubble. The question is always, how long will it last? To answer that, we need to only consider what sustains it. The current situation has been sustained based on three ingredients. Economic growth has remained low to slow. This is required to minimize inflation pressures. Inflation itself has been kept low, and until recently, as a consequence, considered too low. Financing interest rates have been kept at historic lows. If we continue to achieve this, the bubble will continue, barring any unexpected and disruptive shock such as a geopolitical event, a major financial failure, or a natural disaster as an example. The problem we now have is that the exploding size of U.S. debt for government, corporate, and consumer in total is too high against GDP. That is because debt payments drain investment capital from productive investment, which is required to support the debt. To control the debt, policies therefore must be enacted which lift economic growth above trend, elevate inflation so effectively it debases the value of the present debt, keep rates below growth to foster what is referred to as financial repression, and increase revenues through increased taxation. Clearly, current policies are aimed directly at that. What we now have is opposing policy pressures for economic growth and inflation, as well as the burden of increasing taxation. We can't have it both ways, and something has to give. So, what inevitably gives? To answer that, let us consider some key factors that are at play surrounding these conflicting policy requirements. First, in our opinion, we have a secular reversal. The current and expected trajectory of U.S. Treasury rates, given historical spreads, overall debt burden, and interest cycles going back over 100 years suggest that rates have hit a 40-year low and are headed higher over the next 40 years. We also have a demand problem. The reason for the sea change in rates is that the U.S. government has a demand problem for its U.S. Treasuries. One alternative is to allow rates to rise to a level that attracts investors, such as foreign investors. The other alternative, if they want to keep rates low, is to buy the bonds themselves. This will lead to the printing of more and more money. This is financial repression and would subjugate the Federal Reserve to the Treasury for the first time since the post-World War II era. Thirdly, we have effectively started debt monetization. There is a high probability the Federal Reserve will have to continue to print money to buy enough bonds to keep interest rates low. This means yield curve control, and it will be done because the alternatives, that is default, restructuring, higher interest rates, are simply not politically palatable. We will increase levels of financial repression. Yield curve control will serve to keep interest rates running below the rate of inflation for an extended period of time, which will allow us to pay back the debt in the same stealthy manner as that of the time during the period of post-1945. We've been here before, not to this degree by any stretch of the imagination. Philip Miller, Chief Investment Officer at Strategic International Securities, once stated, rising government debt plus rising money supply equals inflation risk. In a classic 1981 study on limits of government spending, Nobel Prize-winning economists Thomas Sargent and Neil Wallace argued that if a fiscal authority's deficit cannot be sufficiently financed by foreign domestic demand to absorb all the debt used to finance government spending, the Fed is forced to become the buyer of last resort, and thus breaking the Rubicon of independent and sound monetary management. This scenario has historically led to high levels of inflation every time, according to an exhaustive review of 133 countries and close to 45,000 observations by Stanley Fischer and Associates during a period from 1957 to 1998. They found that in every instance, when excess budget deficit reaches what is known as the limit principle, currency weakness, inflation, and high real interest rates follow. This was also more recently detailed in the book This Time is Different by renowned scholars Carmen Reinhart and Kenneth Rogoff, so it's pretty clear what the facts are. An independent amount of monetary stimulus, combined with an unprecedented amount of fiscal stimulus, we believe has finally awoken the inflationary beast that has been dormant for over 40 years. Evidence continues to mount that we are in store for a period of sustained inflation, as shown here by excess broad money supply growth and the Consumer Price Index, the CPI, in percentage form going back to 1998. The excess money supply is shown by the 1-year percent change in M3, currency in circulation, plus deposits, plus money market funds, less the 1-year percent change in GDP. It is then charted against CPI. You can see that historically there has been a tight linkage. Since 1951, the Fed has essentially been independent from the Treasury until now. By trying to keep interest rates near the zero bound while being the buyer of last resort for U.S. Treasuries, it is now well on its way to losing its independence, in our opinion. This is straight out of the playbook from post-World War II, and for good reason. This chart shows what the U.S. has spent in response to COVID in a fashion that resembles past global conflicts. We expect the U.S. to employ further macroprudential strategies of financial repression, which means interest rates stay substantially below the rate of inflation, to resemble the cycle from the 1940s to the 1980s. This chart depicts U.S. gross domestic product GDP and the long-term trend of rates on long-term U.S. government securities. The 1940s also began a multi-decade period of elevated inflation. Famed bond investor Dan Faust, vice chairman of Loomis Sayles, recollected how the inflation dynamic led to the 7-fold jump in the value of his family home in the 40s and 50s. Inflation trended higher from post-World War II to 1980. The problem is that once the productivity of debt falls below 1, the only way out for government is to have the central bank keep rates increasingly negative and or significantly devalue the currency. This is because growing debt faster than GDP in a twin deficit, externally financed nation like the U.S. results in a currency crisis in the next economic downturn, as the market begins to doubt the ability of the government to pay back its debt in anything resembling real terms. And you notice I said during the next economic downturn. We are currently in the throes of a recovery from the pandemic. The U.S. dollar will be forced to be sacrificed, and with it lowering of the U.S. standard of living. The U.S. dollar has been in a precarious position for the last decade, as it was weaponized via being made a geopolitical policy tool for U.S. sanctions. The U.S. twin deficit and current account deficit leave little room for maneuvering now. The U.S. dollar has been artificially too high for years, due to the mercantile strategies of Japan, China, many emerging markets, and the Asian tigers. Slowing global growth will elevate currency wars with resulting downward pressure on the U.S. dollar. We are seeing the end of the exorbitant privilege of the U.S. dollar, but not the end of the Triffin paradox. Current debt levels and spending policies dictate the U.S. dollar must be soon sacrificed to keep the system afloat. The trick is to limit the degree of sacrifice. Let's talk about how the U.S. dollar is effectively priced over the intermediate to long term. Historically, the direction and magnitude of the twin deficits as a percentage of GDP directly impacts the nominal effective exchange rate of the U.S. dollar. The twin deficit as a percentage of GDP is shown here in red and advanced by 18 months. You can see we are already approaching and into the expected fallout from excess deficit levels. This chart clearly suggests a trend of substantially weaker US dollar ahead, the green line, which, as an aside, we believe will lead to a bull market in commodities similar to the period from 2000 to 2011. This creates further problem with inflation in the United States regarding import costs coming in, as commodities get more expensive for those export nations to ship to the United States. The US dollar varies in value as measured versus other world currencies in a cyclical fashion. We believe the current cycle of a strong US dollar has peaked, and we are at the beginning of a new cycle which will bring about a weaker US dollar. As we've shown in a recent video, we believe this will be contained to approximately a further 15% erosion in the US dollar. From there, a lot will be dependent on, frankly, the outcome of the US midterm elections in 2022 and possibly policy shifts that may occur there. To us, the charts are very clear on this. Obviously, new pressures will emerge. Some key ones are already evident that will further impact the US dollar that I haven't already mentioned. Concurrent with the inflationary trend that accompanies a weak US dollar cycle is the fact that globalization is rapidly falling out of fashion. There is a renewed focus by sovereign nations to secure or stockpile essential commodities and minerals and reduce their dependence on foreign manufacturing for essential goods. The circumstances around obtaining personal protective equipment at the onset of the COVID-19 outbreak that brought this issue to front and center. Any retreat from globalization is inflationary. The standard explanation for why inflation has been so low for so long in so many places is three words: technology and globalization. The technology side has a lot to do with Moore's law. Over time, more of the goods and services we buy are digital, and computing power gets cheaper all the time. The globalization side has a lot to do with China. Its export machine gives us all cheap stuff and suppresses wages for manufacturing industries worldwide. Is the China as the deflation exporter story over? This charts the U.S.'s import price index for China against the renminbi dollar exchange rate. As the chart makes clear, the exchange rate has a lot to do with whether China exports higher prices to the U.S. Beijing has allowed the renminbi to strengthen somewhat, but the majority of China's trade with the U.S. is still dominated in dollars, so changes in the exchange rate force China exporters to decide whether or not they are willing to absorb the cost of the stronger currency. Those exporters have seen their profits growth fall in recent years, hurt by both the stronger currency and increasing labor costs. Earnings received only a brief bump from COVID-19, which boosted global demand for electronics and healthcare equipment. Now the pressure is really on, as reflected in the 9% increase in Chinese producer prices in May. Passing higher costs on to domestic customers is difficult in China, as evidenced by weaker consumer price inflation. Nor is the government likely to provide relief by weakening the currency. It is more concerned about things like food price inflation and encouraging capital inflows. So Chinese producers, if they want to protect profits, have little choice but to jack up their export prices in dollars. China's producer price index is tightly correlated with oil prices. It is, in other words, imported. Oil prices will lap their pandemic trough soon. Furthermore, high Chinese PPI has not historically led to higher export prices, particularly to the PPI jump in 2015-2017. The question about inflation that dogs all of us, though, is whether this time is different. The answer will depend in part on whether or not the Chinese manufacturers are actually willing or able to pass on higher costs to international customers. We cannot forget many of the obvious problems facing the US dollar. We dedicated our 2019 thesis specifically laying these out. It took 153 pages to do it. Obviously, we're not going to revisit it all here, so we'll have to leave it to you to review the research at the links shown here. Suffice it to say, the US dollar faces major hurdles associated with the weaponization of the US dollar as a policy tool for implementing sanctions, the falling level of U.S.-produced trade products, the deteriorating role of the U.S. dollar as a global reserve currency, the deteriorating role of the U.S. Treasury debt as a measure of risk-free when it can't even maintain a AAA rating, and the shift to a multipolar world with direct trading partnerships to counter the role of the U.S. dollar. It can't be stressed strong enough that the decay in the U.S.'s industrial prowess is serious and a profound problem, which since China entered the WTO has accelerated rapidly. It has been a long time since the U.S. was the manufacturer for the world. The U.S. now consumes massively more than it produces, and the piper has yet to be paid. The payment comes in the form of a devaluation in the U.S. dollar. It has only been delayed by the grace of mercantile strategies of Japan and China and countries producing far more than they consume as they suck untold wealth into their state coffers. I think the conclusions are pretty obvious. The exorbitant privilege that the U.S. has enjoyed is coming to an end. Charles de Gaulle's Minister of Finance coined this phrase, the exorbitant privilege. He used to complain that the dollar status as the dominant international reserve currency afforded the U.S. states an exorbitant privilege in the sense that it could borrow massively in its own currency. Therefore, one has to hope that the American policymakers do not take that privilege for granted and realize that it can be lost by years of undisciplined budget policies. Frankly, I think they've completely lost touch with the fact of what it means to have this exorbitant privilege. And it is a privilege. If they can't keep it, maybe then there will be a chance that corrective economic measurements will be taken before it is too late. A falling dollar when a country is a 70% consumption economy, dependent on others to produce the good that it consumes, is the epitome of a ticking time bomb. We are not there yet, but we are getting closer to some fireworks in the U.S. dollar. We need to stress that we still see the ticking time bomb in the U.S. dollar going off, but at a much later time and probably being later in this decade. As I always remind you in these videos, remember politicians and central banks will print the money to solve any and all problems until such time as no one will take the money or it is of no value. That day is still in the future, so take advantage of the opportunities as they currently exist. Investing is always easier when you know with relative certainty how the powers to be will react. Your chances of success obviously go up dramatically. The powers to be are now effectively trapped by policies of fiat currencies, unsound money, political polarization, and global policy paralysis. I'd like to take a moment as a reminder, do not trade from any of these slides. They are for educational and discussion purposes only. As negative as these comments often are, there has seldom been a better time for investing. However, it requires careful analysis and not following what has traditionally been the true and tried approaches. Do your reading and make sure you have a knowledgeable and well-informed financial advisor. So until we talk again, may 2021 turn out to be an outstanding investment year for you and your family. And I sincerely thank you for listening.